A thin layer of powdery snow blanketed the ground. Beneath it was an icy crust that had assaulted the landscape just hours earlier. The frozen moisture on the trees gave them a glassy appearance. We'd had one of the worst recorded snowstorms in Virginia history, and it was still coming down. I stomped the snow from my boots and took them off. Setting them on the boot tray, I slipped my feet into my office loafers. Then I opened the door to shake my jacket outside of the building. I worked as fast as I could so that minimal falling snow replaced what I was shaking off it. "You're fighting a losing battle," Nora said as she snuggled under an afghan while sitting in a tapestry-covered wing-back chair that she'd taken from one of the rooms in the unused west wing of the mansion-sized house that Lance turned over to me when we were married, back in time. She'd strategically placed it in front of the infrared fireplace that we'd been forced to put in to assist the outdated furnace. Opposite her was a similar wing-back chair that she'd taken from the same part of the house. It was empty and looked mighty inviting. She pulled the afghan tight around her neck. "Close the door, will you? Even with this heater running, I can't get warm. I never thought about the furnace being old." "We haven't had a winter like this since you and I moved here," I said, as I quickly shut out the cold. I hung my down-filled stadium jacket on the antique brass coat tree located next to the door and scurried to the empty chair opposite hers. "Why would you think about the need for this much heat? If the winter was milder, that furnace would have been sufficient." "I guess," she mused as she tucked her chin beneath the afghan. "Why did we come into the office anyway?" I asked as I leaned forward and stretched my hands toward the heater. "Who do you think is crazy enough to venture out in weather like this? Are the roads even open?" "The guy will be by to plow and sand the driveway again in an hour," she said. "I've got him coming every 3 hours until the storm stops." I nodded. "That's fine for our premises, but what about getting to us? What are the roads like? First icy snow, and now this powdery stuff. Are the road crews able to keep up with this crazy storm? It's not like we're in Alaska or Canada, where they're used to weather like this." She leaned forward and stretched her hands toward the heater. "Believe it or not, a man called about 10 minutes ago and said that he was on his way." "It couldn't wait until the storm subsided?" I asked with surprise. She shrugged. "I figure it's a good case if he's desperate enough to travel through this." "Desperate? Or crazy?" I asked. She giggled. "We've had a few of those in our day, haven't we?" I leaned against the back of the chair and closed my eyes. Don't ask me why, but I had it in my head that when I left Helmsley Investigations, I left the crazies behind too. She sat back in her chair and placed her warmed hands to her cheeks. "I think I'd like to close up shop, take a nice hot bath, and get into a warm pair of flannel pajamas after we see this guy. He's the only one we have scheduled, and I'm feeling off today." "Why don't you go back to the house now?" I offered. "I can handle this interview on my own." She vigorously shook her head. "You always screw up the paperwork." "Do I?" I asked with surprise. "I had no idea. You never said." "I didn't want to hurt your feelings," she explained. "Plus, you do it so seldom that it wasn't worth mentioning. I only say it now because I suspect that I'm getting sick, and I don't want to deal with figuring out what you've put in all the wrong places when I'm ill." "Seriously, I'm that bad?" I exclaimed. She shrugged. "Let's just say that it's not your thing." The sound of bells jingling outside caught our attention. We simultaneously scurried to the window to see what was coming up our drive. "Is that a horse-driven sleigh?" she asked with odd surprise. I wiped at the fog that our breath caused as we peered out the window pane and nodded. "Arriving in a horse-drawn sleigh. That's something you don't see every day." "Is he Santa Claus come early?" she giggled. I looked again, grinned, and shook my head. "He's too skinny." "Do you think he's a nut job?" she asked with concern. I shrugged. "He could just be resourceful. I worry about those horses. I hope he didn't damage them by driving over this type of terrain. They could founder if he doesn't have the right gear on their hooves. Besides that, ice can be slippery, and bones do break." "Oh, wow," she gasped. "That's right. I didn't think of that. Those poor horses." We watched with interest as the driver pulled the sleigh up close to the house and then secured its brake. He quickly hobbled the 2 horses, pulling it in such a practiced way that it was clear he'd done it numerous times. "That's efficient," Nora mused.